Hello, cousins, and welcome to Pinto. This beautiful little community was founded by our great-great-grandfather, Lorenzo Wesley Roundy. His father was Shadrach Roundy and his mother, Betsy Quimby. The family joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Spafford, New York, then moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. Shadrach was in Brigham Young's company, which arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. He was one of the three men who on July 23, 1847, were the first Mormon pioneers recorded to plow soil in what became Utah. He's mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants in section 124, and was one of the bodyguards to the prophet Joseph Smith. Lorenzo married Adeline Whiting in 1842, and they had a son named Myron. When Myron was 18 months old, they had another son, George. Adeline died 2 weeks later from childbirth complications, and Lorenzo was left a single parent to raise little Myron and his new infant son, George. He did so for the next 2 years until he met and married Susanna Wallace. Together they had another 9 children. When Lorenzo and Susanna arrived in Salt Lake City in 1847, they soon settled in Centerville, Utah. 10 years later, he met and married another wife whose name was Priscilla Parrish. Together they raised another 8 children for a total of 19 children altogether. Priscilla is our great-great-grandmother. Her children were Fanny, Sarah, Samuel, Joel, Annie, David, Lydia, and Heber. Joel Jesse being our great-grandfather, who had a son named Golden Parrish Roundy, our grandfather. Priscilla is buried in a tiny cemetery east of Richfield, Utah, in a community called Venice. After many years in Centerville, Lorenzo decided to sell out and seek new adventures in southern Utah, still a wilderness inhabited by unfriendly Indians. He settled first in Alton, then on to Kanab, Long Valley, and finally ended up in Canaryville. He became the first bishop of Canaryville and was ordained to this office by the Apostle Erastus Snow. He served many years in the state legislature and spent lots of time in Salt Lake City. He also owned the first flour mill in Canaryville. He was a natural leader, very athletic. He built roads, bridges, schools, and everyone says he was very easygoing. He was a skilled explorer and was called upon and assigned to explore many places that early saints could settle, one of which was Pinto. In the spring of 1847, Sarah Roundy, daughter of Lorenzo Roundy, recorded in her journal, quote, "My father was in the legislature all winter. When he came home in the spring, he said, 'President Young wants me to lead a company to Arizona to explore.' Father was to lead as he had made 2 trips there before. They were to leave in May." In a later entry, she continued, quote, "My father said goodbye to Susanna, his second wife, and to my mother, Priscilla, his third wife, and to each of us children for a total of 3 times each. My father said he would never see us alive again, and he would die with his boots on. His wives told him to tell the authorities then how he felt, but he said that he would rather die with his boots on than go against the authorities' wishes." Some fascinating facts about Lee's Ferry. In March of 1864, the LDS Church paid for lumber to build a ferry boat that could carry wagons, supplies across the mighty Colorado River. Jacob Hamlin was commissioned to oversee the project and was the first man across the river after a successful crossing. 2 days later, Bishop Lorenzo Roundy also crossed the river on the newly built ferry boat. In 1870, a notable expedition guided by Jacob Hamlin included Major John Wesley Powell, first explorer of the Grand Canyon and Colorado River, President Brigham Young, and LDS leader John D. Lee arrived at what is now called Lee's Ferry. In 1873, John D. Lee was assigned to Lee's Ferry to organize any future crossings. He played a leadership part in the terrible Mountain Meadow Massacre, which happened a short distance from here, from where we are standing now. It is believed he went to Lee's Ferry to avoid the authorities. Indians were a threat, and he built a fort which still stands at Lee's Ferry today. He also built a dam to irrigate a newly planted farm and orchard which he called Lonely Dell. The authorities finally caught up to him and arrested him in 1875. He was excommunicated from the church and later taken by authorities to Beaver, Utah, to stand trial for his part in the massacre. The first court resulted in a hung jury. He was retried and found guilty. He was escorted back to the massacre site, and a 5-man firing squad executed him on March 28, 1877. The ferry fell into the hands of his wife Emma. In 1879, the church purchased the ferry rights from Emma for $3,000 and sent polygamous Marshall Johnson and his wives and family to run the ferry. Historians say that he accepted the call, thinking it a good place to live and not be persecuted by the law for practicing polygamy. May came, and it was time for Lorenzo to leave on his expedition to Arizona. One can only imagine his emotions as he looked back at his family as his wagon pulled away from his home in Canaryville that spring morning. After a severe winter and late spring, warm weather set in suddenly, triggering an early rise in the Colorado. President Brigham Young and his counselor Daniel H. Wells, along with some of the apostles and other leaders of the church, were on their way to St. George from Salt Lake City to encourage the saints that had been assigned to settle in southern Utah and bolster morale. President Wells was to accompany Lorenzo Roundy, Jacob Hanlon, and many others on this exploration. The entourage was a most impressive array of churchmen to venture so far from the settlements up to this time. With President Wells and Brigham Young Jr., who also was an apostle, it included Apostle Erastus Snow, Bishops John Newtall, D.D. MacArthur, Lorenzo Hatch, Bishop Lorenzo Roundy, and a host of other dignitaries, Jacob Hamlin, and a large escort of horsemen from Dixie and Kanab, Jim Emmett playing a big part. Upon President Wells' arrival on May 9th, they immediately plunged into a series of meetings, during which it was decided to have a small boat built to carry to the ferry. The skiff was completed in 3 days and loaded onto a wagon headed to Lee's Ferry. It was 12 feet long, had a bottom beam of 4 foot 2 inches, and was 20 inches deep. Little did they know at the time that it would later play a vital part in saving lives on the ferocious Colorado River. This impressive company rode into Lee's Ferry shortly after noon on May 24, 1876. Lorenzo was then 59 years old. Marshall Johnson, the ferryman, met the company and told them that the river was very high and still rising, and the speed and power of the current made use of the ferry boat unsafe. It would be necessary to take the wagons apart and cross everything over the river in the newly built skiff. Johnson said that they had been doing this procedure now for a month, and now with this newly built skiff, it could be performed much more quickly than usual. President Wells demurred, saying there was insufficient time. The schedule demanded that they cross the river by nightfall. This was Johnson's clue to abandon that which he knew to be right, and to bend every effort toward carrying out the wishes of President Brigham Young's counselor. To do otherwise would place him in the position of arguing with God, since Mormon society was structured on the premises that the first presidency was the oracle of the Lord. Everyone in the company listening expected the ferryman to back down gracefully, but to their surprise, he showed his mettle by reiterating that it was unsafe to use the large boat on such high water, and he would not be responsible under those conditions. He did, however, state that he would cooperate fully if President Wells insisted on using the big boat, and elected to appoint a temporary captain other than himself to oversee the operation. Adamant, President Wells selected Bishop Lorenzo Roundy to supervise this crossing because of his experience. All was made ready. Bishop Lorenzo Roundy determined that because of the high water, the ferry would have to be towed upstream along the right bank to allow more room for a landing on the left bank. He ordered teams to be hitched to the empty ferry boat, and with 2 men on board to keep the boat away from the riverbank, she was inched upstream about a half a mile to a shallow cove where half of the animals were driven aboard. The sweeps were manned and the ropes carefully released. The first 2 crossings were successful. It appeared that Johnson had been overly cautious, as 2 round trips had now been made without incident. The final crossing was at hand. By this time it was close to sunset, and the cooks had just called everyone to supper. President Wells told them to put the food on board and they would eat it on the other side. The boat was then loaded with 3 wagons and provisions instead of leaving it empty to be towed upstream like they had done before, even though it was determined that the weight was less. Jim Emmett tightened his cinch and mounted his horse and took the lead as he pulled up the slack around the saddle horn. 8 men were also aboard, including President Wells and Bishop Roundy. Lorenzo and Brother Carter manned the sweeps, turned end for end as poles to keep the boat away from the bank. All went well until they were just short of the cove upstream from a small rocky point that took the full power of the current. At this point, the banks curved toward the canyon's cliff, and the tow rope pulled the boat into the rocky point more than up the river. When the boats were empty, the pole operators were able to hold it offshore. It was necessary to maneuver the boat outside of a large boulder just visible because there was insufficient room for passage between the boulder and the shore. Roundy and Carter worked the pole mightily as the boat inched abreast the point. They were exhausted. The inshore pull of the tow rope and the powerful current shoved the boat against the boulder. Bishop Roundy shouted to Emmett to release the tow rope, but it was a few seconds before Emmett could get his horse to back up and provide the needed slack to be able to release the rope from his saddle horn. By this time, the boulder had served as an inclined plane that raised the beam of the boat and dipped the opposite gunwale below the surface. For an agonizing moment, she hung there. Then the boat careened. The cargo lurched into the river and the ferry rolled over. Emmett had managed to loosen the tow rope, but the knot on the end of his lariat became caught on something and prevented the boat from sliding downstream, which may have saved our awful situation. The other men on the opposite shore watched in horror as men were thrown into the rushing water, unable to help in any way, only to count heads as they came to the surface, stopping at 7 out of 8 on board. Lorenzo was the last man on board, pacing up and down the back rail of the boat, shouting encouragement to the men in the water to swim ashore. Losing all hope of reaching the opposite shore, Lorenzo, a strong swimmer, jumped into the cold, angry water. He swam a short distance and was seen with his hands above his head before he went underwater. Emmett was already on a dead run on his horse back to where the skiff was beached. Jacob Hamlin had swam ashore with President Wells, and he jumped up and ran towards the skiff, obviously with the same idea as Emmett. He was out of breath when he arrived at the skiff. Emmett and another man were launching the skiff. Hamlin jumped in behind them. They saved 3 men, Marshal Johnson, the ferryman, being the last to be rescued. Men paced the banks of the river and hunted through the willows, hoping that Bishop Roundy had made shore without being seen. But the search was useless, and they finally reluctantly concluded that he had drowned. There was a heavy gloom in camp that night, with emotions on the surface of every man's face. Lorenzo loved the Lord. He was faithful and served wherever he was called. He loved his family and was loved by them. He was kind and loved by the people around him. On June 24th, President Wells once again found himself at the riverbank of the mighty Colorado, waiting to cross the ferry boat. The river was higher now than when Bishop Roundy was lost, even though it had fallen 4 feet below its peak. He offered no dissent when the wagons were taken apart and placed into the skiff. He and Brother Ivans waited until the animals had made the difficult swim, and the brethren were reassembling the wagons before Marshal Johnson crossed them over the river. Once safely across, Brother Ivans recorded in his journal, quote, "President Wells took me where the accident to the ferry boat occurred and explained to me his own escape. When we reached a secluded spot by the river, we knelt down and offered thanks to the Lord for bringing us safely over. His prayer was a remarkable one and made a profound impression on me. Apparently, President Wells realized he had erred on May 24th, but he was contrite and had not lost his humility, even though he had lost a dear friend." As a Roundy family, we're proud to be your descendants, Lorenzo Wesley Roundy, and look forward to one day shaking your hand. Thank you for your courage, your faithfulness, and example.
Privately reach